Welcome to American Indian and Alaska Native Living, a program designed to educate and inspire listeners throughout Indian country. American Indian and Alaska Native Living is hosted by Dr. David DeRose, a board-certified specialist in both internal medicine and preventive medicine. Dr. DeRose has a wide range of experience with Native health issues, and he is here today to help you learn more about your health. Here is Dr. DeRose.
Welcome to American Indian and Alaska Native Living. I'm Dr. David DeRose. Today we're tackling a difficult and challenging problem. A lot of people are speaking about it in the business world, but it applies with equal force in any organization, in the home, tribal organizations, wherever we're at. The topic is burnout. And to help us on this topic and getting some practical insights is Dr. Daniel Binus. Dr. Binus, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Dr. DeRose. It's great to be here.
What I love about having you to speak about this topic, not only are you the medical director of Beautiful Minds Medical Clinic in Auburn, California, you're a practicing psychiatrist, you're a well-known speaker traveling throughout the world. I was interested to learn you've been out to Australia speaking with professionals here in the U.S., all on this topic of burnout. Maybe frame it, first of all, with the fact that this is not just a topic for the lawyers and doctors who often call on you to speak at keynote events.
Yeah, so this is a topic that I think a lot of people are talking about because a lot of people, no matter where you are, if you're in the home life or in the workplace, there's significant stress that people are dealing with, and a lot of people are just getting really tired out. And when you look at the definition of burnout, the World Health Organization's definition of burnout, what we're looking at is just those feelings of energy depletion and exhaustion, and then increased mental distance from life, quote unquote, job. And that can be our actual job in the workplace or even our job when it comes to caregiving for our children or maybe being in a marriage. But whatever it is, it's that distance, that sense of disconnect. And then the third element is a reduced sense of efficacy. So we're just really feeling like, boy, we're not doing a good job anymore. And so a lot of people are struggling with that. It doesn't matter if you're a professional or not, that sense of exhaustion, that sense of almost numbness and disconnect, and then just feeling like we're not effective anymore. And so I think a lot of people are interested in the topic, and it's become very relevant for a lot of us.
So if people don't relate to the burnout term, I think a lot of people relate to stress or being overly stressed. Are these sister concepts, or are they really quite different?
They're related because what we see is that chronic stress over time that's not dealt with properly really leads to the syndrome of burnout. And so we don't learn how to handle our lives and the level of stress that we have. Eventually, we will get into that exhaustion and then eventually the burnout where we really feel like we can't even be effective anymore.
Why don't you help us then? Because folks are listening. I think a lot of people are saying, I think I can relate to this. But how does someone know if they have burnout? Are there any indicators that someone should say, hey, you better be concerned about this topic?
Yeah, there's 8 warning signs that I like to talk about, which I think can be very helpful. Just red flags, if you will, to watch out for. And maybe you start feeling like you're drowning a little, that you could look at these signs and be like, okay, how many of those do I deal with? And so the first one is persistent exhaustion. So even if we have a couple pretty decent nights sleep, it just seems like, man, I'm just not getting that energy that I normally have. And I feel like I'm tired most of the time. The second one is trouble focusing. So we were having a hard time concentrating. And this isn't just occasionally, but consistently having difficulty staying on task, getting our work done. A third is irritability. So little things that maybe would annoy us a little bit, but not really irritate us so bad. We're getting progressively irritable. Maybe we're barking at our spouse or our children, or perhaps we're just feeling really angry inside. Maybe we're not expressing that, but that irritability. The fourth is anxiety. So we're feeling uncomfortable in our own skin. We're feeling an undue sense of dis-ease, of worry, of feeling like things are going to go wrong. And then the fifth is depression. And the irritability and anxiety often eventually lead to depression. That can be one of the later signs of burnout. And I'm not necessarily talking as much here about major depression, but just this feeling of being down and not really sure why. Number 6 is more frequent illness. If we're getting sick more often, one thing I always consider is that the mind and the body are very connected. And so if we're chronically stressed out, eventually that's going to affect not only our mental and emotional health, but also our physical health as well. The 7th is social withdrawal. So perhaps you're normally gregarious, you like being around people, or maybe you're not even that outgoing, but you spend time with family and friends. You don't even feel like doing that anymore. And then the final one is self-medication, where we start taking, in a way you might say, matters into our own hands, saying, okay, this is not working out so well. I don't feel good most of the time or a lot of the time. And so I just want to start taking some measures to feel better temporarily, to kind of escape perhaps the ongoing stress and these negative feelings.
Let's hone in on that last one. I think that's perhaps the hardest one to get a handle on. I think a lot of folks can relate to the exhaustion, irritability, feeling down. Those are things that to some extent all of us face at certain times in our life, but when you see this constellation, I mean, it should be getting our attention. But when you get down to this number 8 with self-medication, I mean, at least for me as a professional, Dr. Binus, it seems like often people are self-medicating without consciously doing it. They fall into certain patterns. Is that really true, or are people consciously saying, I need something to deal with this, and they're reaching for X, Y, or Z, and maybe you can fill in those blanks. What are the typical X, Y, and Zs they're reaching for?
Yeah, and when I think about self-medication, basically what I'm talking about it is a way to medicate those negative feelings, the negative emotions, and again, oftentimes to have that sense of escape where I no longer have to deal with all this stuff that's just really bothering me and overwhelming me. So some simple examples here. I think a classic one would be alcohol. That's one that a lot of people use. And a lot of people feel like, hey, alcohol is not that big of a deal. I can have a drink or 2 or 3 and I feel good. I can finally relax. And it's really just my way of coping with stress. The problem people don't recognize is that even a little bit of alcohol has negative effects on your brain and your physical health for that matter. I know there was some talk in the recent years that, actually having 1 or 2 glasses of wine is good for your health. But the reality is it's not. And subsequently, they've done more studies that show that even a little bit of alcohol is detrimental both for mental and for physical health, and increase the risks of cancer, for example. And even 1 glass of wine can start to impair the frontal lobe, which is the part of your brain that's responsible for critical thinking and emotional regulation. And over time, it can actually start damaging our brain. And so we have to be really careful with alcohol. So that's just one example.
Mm-hmm. So talk about some of these other common medications. I know a lot of people don't think of them in those terms, but of course, huge numbers of people utilizing caffeine. A lot of folks would say, well, that's not to help me deal with stress. It's helped me to function. You know, I'm lethargic. I'm not feeling as engaged, and the caffeine helps me be more attentive. Is that something that might be useful in this whole equation, or does that have dangers too?
Yeah, that's a great question. You stole the words right out of my mouth. I was actually going to go to caffeine next. This is the most commonly used drug, psychoactive substance in the world by individuals. And a lot of people feel like, hey, caffeine's great because it helps boost my efficacy at work. How could that not help me combat and avoid burnout, right? Because it's going to give me more energy. It's going to give me more ability to get things done. What they don't realize is the mechanism that caffeine works. And that's, I think, really critical to understand. And so if you don't mind, I'm going to get just a little bit scientific here for a minute.
Just make sure you break it down so we can all follow along.
All right. So basically, what caffeine does is it blocks this receptor called the adenosine receptor. And the adenosine receptor is supposed to be stimulated when we're tired. And so essentially what the caffeine does by blocking that adenosine receptor is that it tricks the body into thinking that you don't need to rest, because normally when that adenosine receptor is stimulated, then that tells the body, okay, you need to rest and have more time to produce more energy. But when that caffeine comes in and blocks that adenosine receptor, then the body thinks, oh, I don't need to rest. I have enough energy, even though it doesn't. And then it keeps working and keeps going and keeps going. What that does over time is that it depletes the body's energy store. And so instead of getting more energy, the more you use caffeine, the more and more depleted your body actually becomes of energy. And now pretty soon you just have to use caffeine to even feel like you're somewhat normal. It doesn't give you a boost any longer because again, you're robbing yourself of that critical energy storage over time. So that's one negative aspect. The other big thing, especially from a mental health perspective, is that it will decrease the blood flow to the brain. So even just 2 cups of coffee will reduce the blood flow to the brain by about 30%. And that is not a good thing for our brain because the blood brings the oxygen and the nutrients to the brain cells. And so it's kind of like having a horse and whipping that horse and saying, run faster, run harder, but I'm going to give you less water and food to do that. Pretty soon that horse is going to get tired. And in the same way, we're doing that to our brain. We're saying work harder, work faster, but I'm going to bring less oxygen and nutrients, because the blood flow is reduced to the brain cells. Over time, the brain is going to get tired out.
So I think you've done a great job of making this understandable. For those who want something more scientific, when you're speaking about depleting energy, I mean, you're talking about at a cellular level? Are you speaking ATP, some of these energy molecules? What actually is going on here? How does caffeine over time deplete energy?
Yeah, so exactly. You mentioned the ATP. So basically with that adenosine, ATP is our body's energy molecule. And as that breaks down, it breaks down to adenosine as it loses the phosphate molecules. And then once it gets to that adenosine state, that it then tells the body like, okay, we need to manufacture more energy. And so again, over time, we're going to deplete our ATP store by using caffeine. And so by allowing our bodies to rest when it needs to, instead of just pushing it, we are actually going to be able to manufacture more of that ATP and get our energy back up to par.
So several implications. This is what I'm hearing you say, Dr. Binus. If I find myself using more caffeine or resorting to more alcohol, on one hand, that should be a red flag that maybe I am in a burnout stage or moving in that direction. But I also hear you maybe speaking preventatively, and that probably do not want to start going down this path because I'm not helping myself to avoid the problem. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. We're just shooting ourselves in the foot. I have an analogy that we could maybe just talk about here in a few minutes that I can share how this works.
Perfect. Because we do have to step away just briefly. I'm talking with Dr. Daniel Binus. He's a psychiatrist. He's the medical director of Beautiful Minds Medical Clinic in Auburn, California. We're going to have information about how you can tap into Dr. Binus' resources, his podcast, his blog post. But all that's coming up, along with some great information, great illustration. Don't go away. Dr. David DeRose with Dr. Binus. We'll be back right after this.
Today's broadcast has been pre-recorded. However, if you have questions about today's show or would like further information, please call 1-800-775-HOPE. That's 1-800-775-4673. We'll be right back after this.
Timeless Healing Insights is here for you and for your whole person health. With that in mind, we invite you to go to our website, www.timelesshealinginsights.org. There you will find a free 30-day lifestyle program. Sign up for it and you'll get daily email reminders for 30 days, links to short videos to give you pointers on a healthier lifestyle. On our website, you can also find information about this broadcast. You can connect with our handouts. You can review archives from episodes of Timeless Healing Insights TV that you have missed. Continued success to you. I'll see you at timelesshealinginsights.org.
We are strong, we are resilient, and we will get through this together. But these are stressful times, and it's important to also practice good self-care. It's normal to feel overwhelmed, anxious, or afraid. But there is hope. Reach out to someone. Connect with your friends. Stay in touch with your community. And know that you are not alone. Learn more at wearebroadcasters.com/hope. Furnished by the National Association of Broadcasters and this station.
When Jim died, I wondered if I would be able to keep the farm. Then I heard about the USDA's loan program for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. It's for women and minorities who may be having trouble getting credit. Once I was approved, the USDA's Farm Service Agency helped me get the credit I needed. Now I don't have to sell, and I can pass the farm down to my kids the way Jim's dad passed it down to him. I know he'd like that.
Contact your local USDA Service Center or visit www.fsa.usda.gov.
Social Security is with you through life's journey from birth to retirement. As your life changes year to year, so do your needs. For over 80 years, Social Security has helped to meet your needs and is committed to improving access to the services that make a difference in your life. Today, you can verify your earnings, estimate your future benefits, apply for retirement, manage your benefits, and even change your address, all from the comfort of your home. Social Security's online services help put you in control with secure access to your information anytime, anywhere, allowing you to spend more time with family, friends, or simply just enjoying the day. Social Security, securing today and tomorrow. See what you can do online at socialsecurity.gov.
Produced at U.S. taxpayer expense.
You're listening to Dr. David DeRose on American Indian and Alaska Native Living. Your comments and questions are welcome. Call now at 1-800-775-HOPE. That's 1-800-775-4673. Here again is Dr. DeRose.
Welcome back to American Indian and Alaska Native Living. Dr. David DeRose with Dr. Daniel Binus. We're speaking about burnout. It is something that can affect anyone. It doesn't matter where you're at in life. You can be a tribal elder. You may not be in the active workforce. You may be a grandmother taking care of grandchildren, an auntie, an uncle. Burnout is no discriminator. Dr. Binus, that message has been coming through very clearly, and we've been trying to understand some of the implications of this. You shared with us some of the dangers of common substances that people may use to try to self-medicate when they're in this state of burnout. Before we jump back there, for some who may just be joining us, quick synopsis, just what is burnout?
So burnout is basically where people start feeling significant ongoing energy depletion, exhaustion, a sense of distance and disconnect from one's life, one's job, one's family life, and then really feeling ineffective, oftentimes both in the workplace and then also in the home life and in our relationships in general.
Okay, so you told us about 8 different warning signs of burnout. You had walked us through those earlier in the program, and we got down to this point of talking about self-medication, some of the risks of resorting to substances. You talked with us about alcohol and caffeine, and as we were about to step into the break, I asked you one of these involved questions, like, can you help us make this more understandable, and is this a preventive strategy? You wanted to share an illustration about an automobile and a flat tire. Did I pick up on that?
Yes. So basically, what I was going to say is, in some respects, self-medication it's kind of like, if you get a flat tire, instead of fixing the flat tire, you get maybe frustrated and and you puncture the other 3 tires, it doesn't make the issue any better, right? And I'm sure you might get some amount of your frustration out, but in the long run, it actually makes things a lot worse. And so, with self-medication, we need to understand that, sure, it can make us feel a little better temporarily, but in the long run, it actually makes things a lot worse. And so that's certainly the case with alcohol and caffeine, but also with some of the other things that we tend to self-medicate with.
So give us that list. I mean, I know there's a lot of things that I hear people talking about when they're under mental stress, but what do you see as a psychiatrist that seems to be problematic as far as some of these self-medications, if you will?
Yeah, so certainly there's other substances. And again, these are the classic self-medication things like nicotine or cannabis. I think cannabis is highly misunderstood by a lot of people nowadays. A lot of people believe that it's naturally occurring and it can really help with anxiety and stress and depression and sleep. And the opposite is actually true. Well, what's really interesting is for a lot of people, it does appear similar to maybe alcohol or other things to help initially, but in the long run, again and again, people struggle more. And I have people coming to my office all the time that I'll ask them about their substance use, and they tell me they use cannabis, and they say, yes, I use it for sleep and for anxiety and for my mood, for depression. And so then I ask them, well, why are you here seeing me? And they say, well, because I'm not sleeping well and because I'm anxious and I'm depressed. And so it's kind of ironic because, again, a lot of times we feel like some of these things might be helping and maybe they appear to at first, but in the long run, they actually make things worse. And part of the issue with cannabis specifically is that studies actually show that it reduces our own ability to be aware of ourselves and the way that things are affecting us, including the drug. And so it's very sneaky, if you will, where we're often not aware when it comes to self-medication. And again, specifically with cannabis, clear studies that show this, of how much it's affecting us adversely.
No, this is a fascinating topic, and I know all of us in medicine, I think today, I mean, of course, you and I have both had practices that were based in California for many years where access to marijuana may have been a little bit more abundant than in some other places in the country. But the point is, I can't tell you how many patients I've seen over the years who, just like you said, I mean, this is, this natural substance that they're finding so helpful, whether they're consuming it as an edible or whether they're smoking it. That's not, when you start talking smoking, I can't tell you how many people with lung problems I've seen that are smoking marijuana. And anyway, that's a whole other story. But
right.
The point is, I think you did a great job explaining the connection with caffeine and adenosine and how something that may seem like it's benefiting us is really hurting us. Do we know that level of biochemistry with marijuana and cannabis? Do we understand why it would make us feel like we're relaxing and controlling our stress, whereas it may be disrupting the mind and unbalancing the mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're still in the discovery phases of this, but what we do know is that we have naturally occurring endocannabinoids in our brain, and anandamide is the most prevalent one and the classic example. So naturally, we have cannabis receptors in our brain. Our brain makes its own cannabinoids, and essentially it is a fine-tuning system for neuronal transmission, meaning it helps to balance the function of our brain chemistry in the way that our brain signals and works. So it's really a fine-tuning mechanism. And then when you introduce a bunch of exogenous cannabinoids, in other words, you consume cannabis from the outside, what are we doing? Well, we're really flooding that system in our brain, that cannabinoid system, with a bunch of extra THC, which binds to those cannabinoid receptors. And that really, instead of fine tuning, it blasts those systems. And so again, at first, it might induce a sense of relaxation or even sometimes a sense of euphoria, because it does have a roundabout way of stimulating the dopamine system as well. But over time, because you lose that ability to fine tune, it makes it impossible for your natural cannabinoid system to balance the brain that it's supposed to. And so now you just, especially once you start using the cannabis regularly, now your brain needs that cannabis from the outside even to feel calm. And if you take it away, and this is where I see, people that I was just talking to a patient yesterday who has been using it for years, and he was telling me that he realizes it's having a detrimental effect on his depression, anxiety, et cetera, even though that's initially what he was using it for. But then when he tried to quit, which he did here recently for about 4 weeks, he became so irritable. And that's because it takes time because our brain then adjusts that new norm, and it takes time for the brain to adjust back to normal. And oftentimes if people are using for, especially, years on end, it'll take at least 2 months for the brain to start to restabilize and rebalance itself. And so that's only even part of the story. I mean, because it's also a depressant in and of itself and depresses brain function on some levels, it actually can also even make it difficult for people to think clearly. And so there's some studies that show that over time, chronic users will start to develop lower IQ, on average 6 to 8 points of lower IQ, which is nothing to sneeze at. And a lot of chronic users, actually some studies even show that the majority of heavy chronic users start developing some degree of psychotic symptoms.
Wow.
And so even having paranoia and at times hallucinations and whatnot. So it's nothing to mess around with. And yet we've legalized it. We've said, it's not that big of a deal and it's not as bad for you as alcohol. And so because of that, it's okay to use it. But just because there's some data that shows that, for example, you're not as prone to have a car accident when you're using cannabis, that doesn't mean that it's safe or healthy for your body or your brain.
Wow. So there's a whole lot we could talk about on this topic of self-medication. Is there anything else that you feel is really critical that we mentioned before we talk some more about burnout and things that we can do to prevent it and help deal with it?
Yeah, absolutely. Just a couple quick things. Sometimes we focus on the substances. Well, sugar and unhealthy food in general can be just as addicting as some of these other substances. And there's studies on rat models, for example, that showed that some of these rats even will prefer sugar over cocaine. Wow. And so there's quite a big draw to sugar, and sugar can be toxic. It is neurotoxic. It actually increases anxiety symptoms. It increases stress. It increases inflammation. And it even, for some individuals that are prone, increases psychotic symptoms. And there's a couple others that I'd love to touch on as well, which maybe we can do here shortly.
Yes, we do need to step away briefly. I'm talking with Dr. Daniel Binus, psychiatrist and medical director of Beautiful Minds Medical Clinic in Auburn, California. We're trying to give you practical skills to help you deal with burnout. I know we've been talking about some things that might be difficult to listen to because they may be pretty close to home, but we're trying to help you to really be in the driver's seat. A lot more really practical stuff coming up. We're going to give you Dr. Binus' website when we come back. Stay tuned for that and more. I'm Dr. DeRose.
American Indian and Alaska Native Living will continue in a moment. If you have questions or comments about today's pre-recorded broadcast, please contact us on the web at aianl.org or call 1-800-775-HOPE. That's 1-800-775-4673.
A message from the National Police Association. It used to be that any able-bodied person would offer to assist a police officer in danger. Now, passers-by are more likely to take a video. There's a better use for your phone when an officer's in trouble. Call 911. Tell the operator where you are and what you see. Then, start your video to provide evidence later. To learn more about how you can assist law enforcement, visit nationalpolice.org. That's nationalpolice.org.
Unlike other health concerns, mental illness is not always easy to see. Depression won't show up on an eye chart, and you can't measure it on your bathroom scale. Sorting out a mental health concern is not something to attempt on your own. You won't find a bipolar disorder by looking at a thermometer. Like many other health conditions, help for mental illness takes professional diagnosis and treatment. Anxiety won't just go away under a stick-on bandage. So the sooner you seek treatment, the better. If you or a loved one has a mental health concern, don't go it alone. Find out what to do. For 24-hour free and confidential information and treatment referral, call 1-800-662-HELP. Learn more at samhsa.gov/support. That's samhsa.gov/support.
Using meth taught me everything about freedom, only not like you think. It taught me how easy it is to lose your freedom. If you think meth is taking control of you, ask for help. You have the power to be truly free. I know. I'm Jan, and I'm free from meth.
If you or someone you know is struggling with meth, call 1-800-662-HELP for 24-hour free and confidential treatment referral. Learn more at samhsa.gov/meth.
You're listening to Dr. David DeRose on American Indian and Alaska Native Living. Your comments and questions are welcome. Call now at 1-800-775-HOPE. That's 1-800-775-4673. Here again is Dr. DeRose.
Welcome back for the second half of today's edition of American Indian and Alaska Native Living. I'm Dr. David DeRose. My guest, Dr. Daniel Binus. Many of you may know Dr. Binus from his presentations, either online or in person. You may have actually been to his clinic there in Northern California. But I've been a bit negligent, even though we're going to get back to our topic of burnout. We haven't really talked all that much about you, Daniel. I promised folks we'd let them know how to get in touch with you. But first, just a bit about your practice. What is the focus of Beautiful Minds Medical there in Auburn, California?
Well, it is mental health, Dr. DeRose, but I think what makes us unique is that we really do our best to address people in a holistic manner. And so we really believe in not just handing out prescriptions for mental health, but especially assessing someone and helping them understand what is at the root cause for their mental health problems, and then addressing mind, body, and spirit.
Excellent, excellent. So if someone wants to tap into some of your work, I mean, I know you have a blog post, you've got a podcast. Tell us a little bit about some of those things you put out for the general public.
Yeah, so I'd encourage our listeners to check out beautifulmindshealth.com, beautifulmindshealth.com. And then the name of our podcast is the Brain People Podcast, which is, it's a fun podcast where me and several colleagues, we get together and discuss various holistic-minded mental health topics and some of the research related to that and practical ways to apply the principles that are helpful to live your best life.
Okay, so website, Beautiful Minds, then Health, like not being sick, like health?
That's right.
It's .com?
Yes.
Okay, so beautifulmindshealth.com. That's going to help me navigate to any of your resources.
That's right.
Is that a safe bet? And then the podcast, the Brain People Podcast.
Yes.
That comes out a couple times a month. Is that right?
Yep. So every 2 weeks we release another episode, and you can find it on any common podcast platform.
Great. Well, we're talking about burnout. We want to get back there. You've been helping us. Well, if we weren't already feeling stressed and overwhelmed, you've been telling us about some of our most cherished habits of humanity, some of these substances that we relate to. There's some folks that are feeling pretty good, though. They say, hey, I'm not using marijuana. I don't use alcohol. Maybe they use tobacco ceremonially, but they say, well, I'm not, addicted to nicotine. And so they're feeling, good. Are there some other ways that people self-medicate other than the sugar? We won't go too far down that path, but anything else that is especially of concern to you as a psychiatrist that you're seeing in patients?
Yeah, I think the one other thing would really be related to entertainment media. You know, in recent years, this is something that a lot of people have said, well, it's actually really helpful and healthy to have, you know, enough, media because it makes your life easier. We can do a lot with it. And certainly I'm not anti-technology, and I think there's a lot of good that can come with it. I mean, even what we're doing right now is related to technology, and that's wonderful. But there's also a lot of research that shows that if we use entertainment media unwisely, that it can really start to consume us as human beings, and it starts kind of using us, if you will, rather than we using it as an effective tool. And so there are quite a few studies that show a relationship between unhealthy use of entertainment media, which could include television, video games, social media, watching videos on YouTube even, all these things that we have, or Snapchat, or, you know, all these things. If we're using them in an unhealthy and excessive manner, then there are definite connections with increased depression, increased anxiety, increased aggression. And then even, especially for older people, we start looking at connections between cognitive decline and entertainment media. And for our younger people, a lot of ADHD, concentration issues. And so again, it's easy to check out when we're feeling stressed and kind of on that burnout spectrum. We often just want to check out and get into a different world, and media can be a simple and easy way to do that, but it's not healthy or helpful in the long run.
Well, you know, this is a really interesting question, and a lot of people, even professionals, say, well, you know, where do you draw lines? Because I think most things that people do for entertainment or for recreation, they say, well, part of the reason why that works is it engages me. You know, I'm thinking about something else other than my problems, other than the stressors. And so when you use this term entertainment media, I've heard different people define it different ways, but let me just ask a practical question. I'm doing a men's health group right now. Some of our listeners know about this. And a lot of guys will say, hey, my out is watching sports. Is there a difference if they go to a stadium and watch a sporting event, or if they watch it on television, or what? Do you see what I'm asking? Is there something intrinsic about the TV medium?
Yes.
Can you help us through that?
Absolutely. There is actually a difference. And the difference is, well, some of us might remember some of these older shows like, you know, Leave It to Beaver and Lassie and Flipper and television back in the day. I won't say it's ever been 100% healthy or good, but it was different in that it was quite a bit slower. Okay. What we notice now is that when you watch a clip on entertainment media, so on television or movies or even social media, what we see is the clips are very short. And so it'll show someone's face for a couple seconds, and then it'll shift frames to another scene. And what people who produce this content have realized is the more you can shift scene changes and shift the frame of reference, the more engaging and interesting it is to the brain, because it releases a little bit of dopamine every time you see something new and from a different perspective. And so again, that makes you interested, but what it does to the brain is it overstimulates that dopamine center, and at the same time shuts down the frontal lobe to a degree. And what that does is the critical thinking part of your brain starts shutting off. And so the problem with that is that when we look at mental health problems like depression, anxiety, etc., and even chronic stress, is that perpetuates the underlying issue. In other words, when people are depressed or anxious, you have overactivity in the emotional part of the brain and underactivity in the frontal lobe of the brain. And so essentially with media, that's exactly what you're doing as well. You're perpetuating that problem. You're bringing overstimulation to the emotional part of the brain, and then you're shutting down the logical part of the brain, which is the frontal lobe. And again, to your example, if you were in person watching that sporting event, there wouldn't be those scenes of reference change. Yeah, there would be a degree of excitement and engagement and this sort of thing. And depending on maybe how much stimulation at the game, because certainly you could have some frontal lobe suppression at the game too, especially if you're having a drink of alcohol or two. But you're not getting that rapid scene of reference change ongoing, and so there's going to tend to be less of the frontal lobe suppression.
So what guidelines do you give your patients? I mean, what do you tell them when it comes to entertainment media?
I tell people, according to the research, that if you're a child or adolescent, then you want to cap it at no more than 1 hour a day. If you're an adult, then, and your mental health is reasonably good, then you really want to try to cap it at 1.5 hours per day. And so, that would be the max that you'd want to get to. And that includes all entertainment media, including, like I said, social media, television, video games, and movies. And now there is a difference, a significant difference between just doing like work on a computer. Like, for example, I do my charting on a computer for my patients, or even watching a real like educational lecture on YouTube. That's different because you're not getting, that's engaging you intellectually. You're not getting that rapid scene of reference change, and you can stay engaged. Your brain can stay engaged in a more healthy manner. But it's when you're getting that overstimulation that's the problem.
Well, we've got some other things I know that you've got up your sleeve that can help people dealing with burnout. Let's talk about, someone who says, hey, yeah, I've checked all the boxes. You went through these warning signs. I've got all this going on. I hear the stuff about self-medication. I want to try to get away from that. But where do we go from there as far as trying to help someone who's dealing with this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as we often say in mental health, and especially preventive health, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So there are certain principles that science shows us can help prevent burnout. And then even once it starts, the good news is that if we understand these same principles and apply them starting today, then we can start to reverse the effect of burnout.
You got me all ears, and I'm sure my listeners are as well. What can we do to prevent or treat burnout?
All right. So I'm going to give just kind of an umbrella preview of what the science says. But part of the problem with the science on burnout, I think it's pretty early overall. And so what we'll then delve into is the evidence-based things that can actually be done to meet these scientific goals, so to speak. And so there's 3 things that the science says. They say we got to set realistic goals in life, number 1. Number 2, we have to prioritize taking care of ourselves. And number 3, we have to create and maintain boundaries. And so those are the 3 big things. But again, those are great principles, but how we practically do that can be a little challenging sometimes.
So we hear a lot about self-care, and some of what we've touched on already would come under that heading, right? Avoiding some of these substances that may ultimately undermine our mental health. But under that self-care category, what other things are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really makes me think about when I was in my psychiatric residency training program, I was trying to figure this whole thing out myself. How do you have healthy self-care, especially when you're caring for others? And, that might be at work or in the family or both or in other places. And certainly that's the case in mental health. And when I was doing my training program, I saw essentially 2 main groups in many of the professors I was working with. And one group I saw protected themselves from burnout pretty well. And they were, focused on maybe doing some self-care. But I also saw the other side of that coin where a lot of them seemed a little bit aloof or almost callous to the needs of the people they were caring for. And I think, again, that was kind of a self-protective mechanism. So sometimes, with avoiding burnout, we feel like, okay, well, we can only give so much. And so we have to hold ourselves back. But then in so doing, sometimes we lose that empathy, that compassion, and that ability to really connect with people. And I said, that's nice, but I want to do that a little differently. And so I'd like to share with you. what I came across there.
We definitely love learning from practical experience, and I'm very engaged. I want to hear this, but we do have to step away just briefly. We've got one final group of PSAs, announcements that we've got slated. We're going to run those, and then we're going to come back to Dr. Binus. I'm Dr. DeRose. You're listening to American Indian and Alaska Native Living. Dr. Binus back with us for our final segment right after this. Don't go away.
Today's broadcast has been pre-recorded. However, if you have questions about today's show or would like further information, please call 1-800-775-HOPE. That's 1-800-775-4673. We'll be right back after this.
If a natural disaster comes knocking, how prepared is your family? You can't just close the door on earthquakes, floods, or hurricanes and hope they go away. That's why it's important to make a plan now. Ready.gov/plan has the tools and tips you need to prepare your family for an emergency. So if disaster shows up at your doorstep, you'll be ready. Visit ready.gov/plan and make a plan today. Brought to you by FEMA and the Ad Council.
I'm just texting him back. I'm just posting a story. I'm just changing the song.
No. When it comes to distracted driving, just don't. Sending a text takes your eyes off the road for just 5 seconds, but in that time, your car can travel the length of an entire football field. Any distracted driving just isn't worth it.
Visit StopTextsStopWrecks.org. A message brought to you by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Project Yellow Light, and the Ad Council.
What is a number story?
My number story started with fear and a lack of support, and it has led me to be there for others.
A number story begins in our childhood with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences.
My number story begins with the separation from my father and the emotional abandonment from my mother, and leads to me being a role model to not only myself, but those around me by becoming the person that wasn't there for me.
ACEs are so common, 2/3 of us have one.
My number story begins with drug abuse and homelessness and leads to realizing that I can live life by my own standards.
A study found the more ACEs, the more likely we may experience a host of serious health effects, physical and mental, but that doesn't need to be the case. Your ACE number is simply an entry point to your own story. Where it leads is up to you.
My number story begins with years of emotional abuse and leads to peace, clarity, and security in my self-worth.
Take control of where your number story leads at numberstory.org.
You're listening to Dr. David DeRose on American Indian and Alaska Native Living. Your comments and questions are welcome. Call now at 1-800-775-HOPE. That's 1-800-775-4673. Here again is Dr. DeRose.
Welcome back for our final segment of today's edition of American Indian and Alaska Native Living. I'm Dr. David DeRose with Dr. Daniel Binus. He's the medical director of Beautiful Minds Medical in Auburn, California. Daniel, we were speaking about this challenge of appropriate self-care. It's a topic that relates to anyone, but especially when we think of us in our caregiver roles, whether it's in the family, the tribe, tribal council, whether a person's native or not, they can relate to different roles. They don't have to be a health professional. You saw this, though, in your residency. You were observing. There were different mentors that you had. Some seemed to be navigating this well and others not so well. What kind of observations did you draw that can help us today?
Yeah, so again, one group I saw seemed to be doing well, overall, but they seemed like they lost some of that compassion and empathy and almost seemed a bit callous. And I said, okay, I'm glad they're not falling to pieces, but I don't want to become callous or hardened toward my patients or anyone that I'm working with. I want to have empathy and compassion. And then the other group I saw were people that continue to have empathy and compassion, pour themselves out into their patients. And yet they seemed like they were breaking down over time. They were becoming burned out and struggling with what we might call compassion fatigue, which is a subtype of burnout. And so I started thinking about this, and I actually spent some time meditating and praying about it too. And I realized when I thought about it, it's like, wow, Jesus in his work with people, he was constantly going and helping others. He was constantly, it seems like, working to uplift human beings who were struggling with illness and were really struggling with mental health issues and spiritual issues. How did he not burn out? Became my question, because he was so busy with all these things and yet he didn't go crazy himself. And so I started digging into this a little deeper, and I realized that Jesus did one amazing thing on an ongoing basis, and that is he took time aside every day. I believe, I think it's inferred. We don't see it explicitly in the Bible, but I believe it was every day he took specific time with communing with his Heavenly Father. And he often would go out into nature. He would get up early, and that really refueled him. It helped him to understand what his game plan was for that day. It helped him understand what his priorities needed to be, and it empowered him to have the strength to do the work that he was called to do. And for me, that was pivotal. I was like, you know what? That's what I need to do in my own life. And since I've done that, and I really have prioritized that time, I've basically carved out time in my day that is non-negotiable. I've said, this first time in the morning, I need to spend getting reconnected with my own heart, with the heart of God, and understanding what it is that he wants me to prioritize today, and being refilled, getting my own cup refilled so that I can give during the day. And then, God and I try to have a debriefing time towards the end of the day as well to kind of process what happened. And that allows me to, again, have what I might call an emotionally clean house and a balanced perspective, a balanced life, and not get burned out or empty myself.
So for someone who may not relate to the Christian element, what I hear you saying is you're looking at what gives meaning and purpose in your life, and you're taking time to focus on that at the beginning and the end of the day. I don't want to minimize, as a Christian myself, I don't want to minimize that relationship with God, but for someone who doesn't come from that perspective, could we say they could get some of that benefit by just making time at the beginning and the end of the day for that kind of reflection?
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot to be said there. The one thing I will say, though, is when we're focused on just, our own priorities and, the meaning in our life and the direction we want to go and all that's fine, but it does leave out that connection piece, which I think is critical. And sure, maybe we can connect with nature, and that can be very nice, but I think there is something extremely powerful about cultivating a personal spiritual connection with a personal higher power that loves us, whether we call that higher power God or Jesus. But the bottom line is and even models like AA, like the 12-step program, for example, very clearly show this and teach this, that we have to have a sense of something that we're connected to get power from outside of ourselves. And that's what I've found extremely powerful in the Gospels and in my relationship with God personally. And yeah, I'm not trying to talk down to anyone that believes differently. I understand, and I have many patients who are agnostic or atheist or of other religions, and we do well together. But I do want to encourage our listeners, hey, why not consider, maybe even if you haven't thought about a Christian's God, and maybe you've maybe even been hurt by bad religion, which happens a lot. But maybe, spend a little time seeing what the Bible actually shows in the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and how this shows us an example of an individual, meaning Jesus, who lived in an amazing way and was able to help many, many people and still have that balance in his own life. And there's so many of these teachings that I think we can all learn from, whether we're, Christian or not.
A couple of concepts maybe we can touch on before we wind up, unless there's a more important place to go. I know you and I had a chance to talk before the show about some of the things that you do with your patients, some of the things you've presented in your public lectures. And not all that long ago, I had another guest that was speaking about some of these terms as well. And I think there may be a true application to some of these terms. I'm thinking of things like grounding and mindfulness. but there's also some applications where people say, hey, that's going a direction I'm not comfortable going spiritually because it has some of these maybe mystical connotations or other things. Is it worth talking about some of those things, or is there a more important place to go at this point in the show?
Yeah, I think I'd like to just mention, when we talk about the practical elements of beating burnout, 3 key concepts, principles that I'll just mention real quick. And then certainly we can touch on this idea of the mindfulness and the grounding and that sort of thing. But I believe the 3 keys for success, once we've kind of connected in our own hearts and ideally with a spiritual connection, is to, of course, through that process, get our priorities straight, get our marching orders, so to speak. And then after that, what the research actually shows is that, number one, connecting even beyond spiritual connection, connecting with other people in relationships is critical for managing our stress. So that is huge. Number 2, the third key for success is control. In other words, we need to have a healthy sense of control. That's different than being controlling and trying to control all the things of our life. Instead, it has to do with, okay, am I able to have a healthy sense of control in my life? Am I able to be at a job, for example, that reflects the values that I uphold? Am I able to respond? I can't control a lot of things that happen to me, but am I responding in a healthy way to the things that are happening to me? And we call that internal locus of control. And then the third thing is what I call stress inoculation. So these are really the self-care things that we highlight when it comes to dealing with stress in a healthy way. And I'll just mention a couple of them because I don't think we have time to delve into all of them. But, exercise is absolutely critical. Spending time in nature, maintaining healthy nutrition, practicing gratitude, remembering to rest both on a nightly and a weekly basis. And then finally, you touched on the grounding piece earlier. This can also be very helpful when it comes to dealing with stress and kind of inoculating ourselves for stress.
30-second question. Grounding. What is the proper, correct way of looking at that without getting into some of this mystical or fanciful thinking?
So basically, what healthy, true grounding is, it's being present in the moment. It's getting out of that fight or flight state. It's connecting with our environment around us. It's saying, okay, what's going on around me right now? Who am I with? What am I supposed to be doing? It's allowing our emotions to settle down and just being here right now, enjoying and being grateful for the gift of the present that God has given us. And that's what true grounding is all about.
Wonderful. Dr. Binus, our time has just about slipped away from us. Before we go, you've got some great resources that people can get online. Can you tell us one more time how we can connect with you?
Yes, please check out our website, Beautiful Minds Health, beautifulmindshealth.com, and then also our podcast on various podcast platforms, the Brain People Podcast. Thank you so much, Dr. DeRose, for having me on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Binus. And thank you to each one of you who've joined us for today's edition of American Indian and Alaska Native Living. As always, I'm Dr. David DeRose, wishing you the very best of health.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.